Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Weekend edition, and we have in studio with us today Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis, and this is going to be quite a program, simply because there are so many things to talk about. I put together a list of 13 things, and that didn't even include some of the investigation by Robert Mueller. So, Penna, as we've oftentimes said, no way we'll cover all the issues today.
Sometimes it is fun to tell people how we make the sausage here, but a lot of times for the Friday show, whoever's hosting will send out a list of articles for people to read. Well, you did that yesterday, and then you did another one late last night, and then Debbie sent a couple of them out today or late last night. So it was like, now we have to pick and choose from all these compelling issues.
And again, a lot of things to talk about. Debbie Georgiadis is a talk show host, which you will get a chance to hear over the weekend, and she'll pick up maybe the pieces that we left behind or some of the others. But Debbie, let me just mention for just a minute that we said you were at CPAC, and I think some of our listeners would love to know exactly what was taking place when you were there in the nation's capital listening to all those conservatives.
Yes, thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. My husband came with me for the first time. This is my third time I'd gone. A little background on CPAC just is that it is intended and targeted for younger people. So many conservative conferences are made up of adults and maybe even towards seniors. But this had dozens, and I was even hundreds of college students and very young millennials. So it was very inspiring to see them there interested in the conservative message. One high point I think everyone probably saw on the media was that President Trump came and spoke on Friday morning. He spoke for an hour and 20 minutes, which was very long, and he got a big cheer when he said, "Oh, let me just go off my script and just talk to you." So, probably his handlers are wringing their hands behind the scenes, but he was honestly really enjoyable to listen to. He spoke about he recognized that conservatives were concerned during the campaign that he wasn't really conservative, and he said, "I think I've proved I am." And he went through a few examples, one being just his selection of Justice Gorsuch, who now sits on the Supreme Court. That was, it was kind of fun to listen to him. And I will say the other, back to the audience, we happened to be seated because we didn't get in line before 6 a.m. at a seat way back in the back. So we were surrounded by college students. In fact, my husband said, "I feel like we're the chaperones here." But what was great was all these students were, fist pumping, clapping, cheering. They really liked President Trump. It was as a real counter to what the media will try to tell you. So that was a highlight. Another highlight I mentioned as we were sitting here in the studio right before we went on air was they brought in via video a panel from the Colorado Christian University, and they had one. It was a bit of a debate between two men. One there, and I'm sorry, I don't have the titles in front of me, but one of them I believe was the president of Colorado Christian, or else he's one of the leaders there, talking about how marijuana legalization has hurt Colorado and how it would be such a great thing for people to speak up against it. The other person, who also self-identified as a conservative, said he's a war veteran. He's a military guy. He had a ponytail. He's a war veteran, military guy, conservative. And he said, this is just a states' rights issue. Colorado voted for it. And that's what the people want. And there's no constitutional prohibition. And so conservatives' legitimate position should be to support states' rights. And I thought it was a little bit of a window on some of the distinction within the Republican or conservative side between pure constitutionalists versus people who say, well, what's happening to our culture? And you look like you want to say something.
Well,
Pam.
because like in the run up to CPAC, we did hear about controversies over how they handle the issues of transgender and homosexual, quote unquote, rights. And I know that there was one group that was actually asked not to have a booth. They were a group that highlights some of the abuses and the push of the homosexual agenda in public schools across the nations. It's called Mass Resistance. And they were asked just a few days before just not to show up, not to have a booth. And so it's kind of the definition of what conservatism is, that always has to be, we have to be on guard in a sense. And so when you go to some of the conferences, you see a lot of gray hair there and you don't have these controversies as much. But when you go where there are younger people, I think that is the generation that not all certainly, but many of them are so taught compassion and don't want to offend groups of people, want to be friends with everyone, that even though they may have a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, and they've been taught homosexual behavior is, a sin against the Bible, they don't want to exclude these people. And so this is a discussion that has to be had. And I think CPAC has leaned libertarian on it. Let's put it that way.
I think they would actually, some people would identify CPAC as libertarian, as not necessarily, a broader based conservative, social conservative message. But one good change that happened this year, or I viewed as a good change. So a few years ago, the board of CPAC included several people who were very friendly to Islam, and therefore they banned some organizations that wanted to come and talk about the dangers of radical Islam in the world, the impact of Islam in America, and the spreading of potential jihadist roots within America and various groups. The people in America who wanted to expose that were banned from CPAC a few years ago. And in fact, the particular person, I think he's been on your show, Frank Gaffney, the founder of Center for Security Policy, was told basically goodbye and don't come back. Yeah. And that was about 2 or 3 years ago. He was I think he was on the agenda 3 times. He spoke eloquent. I mean, it's just and I'll say the other kind of generic point about CPAC is sometimes the media might try to portray it as kind of a, simple-minded, rah-rah, not very deep or substantive. But honestly, there were just countless programs, very serious, very substantive about education policy in America, about the freedom of parents to choose various things related to education and related to vaccines. Just a lot of substance to the weekend, to the 3 days there. And the more you attended, the more you could get out of it.
Yeah. Mona Charen said some things that were controversial, right?
She sure did. I missed that one, but she made a reference to, I'm not sure what the panel was about. I think
it was a Me Too panel.
Yeah.
It was about the Me Too movement.
Yes, it was.
And she made some reference to, not by name, but by allusion to President Trump and how, we're being hypocrites as conservatives if we get behind a man who wrote about in a book his adventures outside of marriage, his poor behavior outside of marriage. And obviously an allusion to what President Trump wrote in a book a few years ago. And the audience booed her quite. I mean, I read this. We were not at that one, but I read about it. And, it's interesting. They weren't willing to hear that kind of argument of truth, which I don't think is the right thing. I think she's, you can disagree with her, but it's a valid point in a conference where you're coming to talk and exchange ideas.
Yes. Well, if nothing else, that was CPAC. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, you'll probably talk about it again on your radio show this week, don't you think?
Yes, I will.
So again, we have a link to that in just a few minutes. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, this is the funeral today for Billy Graham. He also was able to lie. His body was lying in state in the rotunda. And they're talking about actually now having a statue of Billy Graham in the Statuary Hall in the Capitol. And as you might imagine, that's a little controversial, so we'll come back and talk about that briefly. But then we'll get into all sorts of issues related to the Supreme Court. They have been considering all sorts of cases about compulsory speech. We've already talked about that in terms of Masterpiece Cake, but also what about public sector unions? What about free speech? Those are certain very important issues. And Donald Trump said, well, I showed you I was conservative. Then a few days later did some things that didn't seem so conservative. So we'll talk about that. And we have lots to cover with Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis. We'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, the news over the last year has been about the surveillance of the Trump campaign and administration. But there is another more personal issue. How much surveillance has the federal government done of your life? John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute was on my radio program recently to talk about the threat we all face from government and business surveillance. We began by quoting from the Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. In a case back in 1966, he warned, "We are rapidly entering the age of no privacy, where everyone is open to surveillance at all times, where there are no secrets from government." How right he was. The government has become expert in finding ways to sidestep what is considered inconvenient laws aimed at ensuring accountability. For example, the National Security Agency has been diverting Internet traffic overseas. This helps them bypass Fourth Amendment and other constitutional protections and allows them to conduct unrestrained data collection on each of us. I asked John Whitehead about the stories of the government hacking into Google and Yahoo data centers. He responded that they really don't have to do that since these entities and others willingly turn over such data. He estimates that on any given day, the average American is monitored, surveilled, tracked, and spied upon in more than 20 different ways. We also talked about the recent column by John Cass, who wondered whatever happened to liberals concerned about civil liberties and government surveillance of American citizens. He concluded that since it was happening to Trump officials, those who used to be concerned about such issues now turn a blind eye to it all. We shouldn't ignore what is happening, and that's why I've written a point of view booklet on surveillance and privacy to warn citizens about what is happening. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgiades Penna-Dexter in studio with us, our weekend edition, which we certainly are going to try to cover lots of things in the news. We'll spend most of our time looking at some of the political issues, but let's talk about Billy Graham for just a minute. The funeral taking place today. I've been to the Billy Graham Library Museum, and I've been to the parking lot. That's where they're going to put the tent. So that's going to actually, in a sense, remind us of Billy Graham going to what he called the Canvas Cathedral. And that's where a variety of individuals, about 2,000 individuals, will be at the funeral today.
That's a hard number. I mean, that's a very small number. I'm sure so many more people wanted to go, but it was by
I've been
invitation.
in that parking lot, and it's going to be tight in that parking lot to get 2,000 people in that little small parking lot with a canvas tent. But anyway, that's the plan. Of course, he was able, his body was actually put in the Capitol Rotunda. And as we were going to mention Wednesday, we just never got to it with some of the others. We posted an article on Wednesday by a writer for the Religion News Service saying that it's just not appropriate that we would have the body of Billy Graham in the Capitol Rotunda because that's reserved for political people. Well, first of all, he acknowledged that Rosa Parks had been there and some others. And I just thought, would he dare have said that the Reverend Billy Graham could not be in the rotunda? Would he say that if it was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.? No, he would not have said that. Later on, the article is pretty obvious that the real reason, I think, was, how can I use this word? Billy Graham was an evangelical, and so he thought that was inappropriate. But if you thought that was controversial, now we have a law that was actually passed by the North Carolina legislature. and it was one that called for a statue of Billy Graham to replace Charles Aycock, former governor, in that statuary hall. Now, that seems appropriate to me, but don't you know we're going to hear from everybody about whether or not Billy Graham's statue belongs in Statuary Hall right there in the
Where's
Capitol?
the Freedom from Religion Foundation? I'm sure we'll be hearing from them, the
I'm sure we'll.
humanists, ACLU.
Yes, I probably will. But nevertheless, that's a little bit on Billy Graham. And one of the things that I thought was very well written, and some of you have it in front of you, is our friend Jeremy Dice, who was on last Friday, wrote a piece that's in the Hill. Can America Hostile actually endorse Billy Graham? I thought it was just very well good. And again, will we ever have another Billy Graham? What's your thoughts?
Well, one thing I learned from this article that Jeremy wrote, that even the very first places that Billy Graham preached, the very first crusade that he had was in Michigan, Grand Rapids, I think, and there were 6,000 people, and it was a civic auditorium, which is government owned. And then he listed many other venues where Billy Graham preached, and they were government owned, including the Tangerine Bowl in Florida. And so, but really, would that be possible now? I mean, we would have a fight every single time, and you would have to, relitigate it again and again. So Jeremy might be right in asking this question. It would be sad, and the nation would have lost a lot if we had not allowed Billy Graham to have such a high profile. As far as the Capitol goes, I mean, in a sense, it'd be a good thing to fight for, to have the statue there. In another sense, it'd be really sad to be fighting over that.
Yeah, certainly would.
You know, what this is getting, obviously, you probably all our listeners know this, but this is just an argument over what constitutes the establishment of religion. The First Amendment saying, Congress should make no law prohibiting free exercise or establishing religion. And the idea that permitting someone to speak in a public venue, you're looking for a constitution, going right here.
Yeah, got one right here too.
And but the idea that permitting any language related to religion to be in any way connected with public property, or the example that was in the article I have posted by Jeremy Dice, is saying because a microphone that was owned by the state was used, that did constitute in cases he alluded to. So it really is it's an important legal question, because I think that we've erred, and the Supreme Court has erred too far in finding any kind of, bumping elbows with religion and the state to be a problem of establishment. The pendulum has shifted too far that way. I do think that's a dangerous thing. And, on his particular question, his article is about could we ever have another Billy Graham? I just never want to surrender that America could become so hostile to religion and that we can't come back. We can't reignite the fire in America, at least to say, even if you're an atheist, that I respect your right to deeply, passionately love your religion and want it spoken, and that it is more wholesome and healthy for America to have public dialogue and have someone like Billy Graham in a public arena than to have a sterile atmosphere. I've also, one last quick thing, and then, which is, if you have people, for example, who are strident advocates for same-sex marriage or some other issue, and they're not doing it in the name of religion, but they're out stridently advocating something that's inconsistent with many people's religious beliefs, and you permit that in a public arena, you're kind of saying messages that target faith are fine. Messages that defend faith are not. Well,
that's what it's becoming. And I do think that we could turn it back. I think because, for instance, the existence of First Liberty Institute and groups that will actually do the case for you for free if your faith is under attack or under fire. So we have that. And also, Donald Trump, our president, has come out strongly for religious liberty and has actually taken a lot of actions in the administration to protect religious liberty. So that's another. And I think also, when you have on one side secularism taking hold and the bad effects of that, and then those of us who know the Lord and, want to press his principles into the culture, I think we have an opening then. So I do think that it's possible for the pendulum to swing back.
We've talked about the First Amendment. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But I had somebody that actually heard Billy Graham speak in East Berlin when he was in the military. So I thought it'd be fun to hear from that. Raymond in California, KYCC, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kirby. Ladies, nice to join you this morning.
Good to have you.
Yeah, my friend, thank you. My friend Dave Pesmenti and I, he led our Bible study when I was stationed over in Berlin, and found out that Billy Graham was going to speak there. So we had to put on our Class A uniform, and go over there, because when you're in West Berlin and you traveled through the corridor in East Berlin, you sort of had to do a show of flag kind of thing. And when we got to the church, of course, there was a massive line of people out front, but the leadership of the church saw us in uniform, and of course, in Eastern Bloc countries, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. So they came out and they kind of showed us some particular attention, and they brought us around the back, and they let us into the sanctuary even before they opened it. And when they opened it, the crowd got to be so huge. I looked at my friend and I said, I'm not going to sit here. We can see Billy Graham in Omaha, Nebraska if we want to. So we stood up against the wall, and I guess he must have seen that, or he must have heard about it. He came out actually before he spoke. He weaved through the audience, and it made it a point to come and shake our hands and say thank you for giving up our seat.
Wow, what a great story.
Yeah.
And again,
really
one of the things we've heard from a number of people, even last week, we talked with the official biographer of Billy Graham, talked about his humility. And this week we had Lee Strobel in studio, and he was talking about the humility of Billy Graham and just the fact that he just loved people. And there's just a wonderful story about that, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And I think, in a lot of the things that have been published since his death, people say, well, it's not that he was just filled with these lofty ideas. He just articulated a simple message, and it was so obvious that he believed it, that, it just came from deep down within. And so that those convictions about the principles of faith are what came through in his ministry.
Let me just mention, too, we did have William Martin on last week, and he's the biographer for Billy Graham. I've actually spoken in his class. He was a professor, still is a professor at Rice University. He was having me down to actually debate me, but that's okay. That was fine. But the book is now out. It came out in 1991 called A Prophet with Honor. And since then, he's updated it, added 4 new chapters. And it's, matter of fact, I got a copy right around the other side of the glass there. It's about 900 pages. But, of course, a lot of that is the end notes. And it gives you the complete story about Billy Graham and Ruth Graham and the kids and his ministry and the Modesto Manifesto, where they made some of those decisions and all of that. So if you really wanted to sit down and read about Billy Graham and learn all the details, this is the book, and it's now coming out through Zondervan, and it just arrived, and so I would recommend it to anybody that's interested in knowing more about Billy Graham, and especially for the millennial generation. We did the Millennial Roundtable a week ago. Nobody had ever heard Billy Graham in person. They'd never been to a crusade. I don't know that they'd ever seen him on television. So for the younger generation, you're missing an opportunity to know a really great man who Greg, I guess it was, it was Greg Laurie said he thinks he's the greatest evangelist that we've ever had. And that's pretty strong comments from a guy that himself is an evangelist.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of the number of years, decades really, since Billy Graham actually retired. It's a long time, and yet he was still there praying and influencing the country.
From Harry Truman to Barack Obama, there has never been anybody like him, probably never will be anybody since. We'll take a break and come back and talk about First Amendment issues right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We did mention Billy Graham, and throughout the week we've posted some various articles by Billy Graham, so you can find those on the website, pointofview.net. But if you go to our articles today, the first two have to do with the First Amendment. And aren't you glad we have a lawyer in studio with us? Debbie will help us out here. First Amendment and public unions, First Amendment and free speech. What about this one? Because for, in round numbers, 40 years, the Supreme Court has said that it is quite appropriate for public unions to force individuals to join a union and to have those union dues used in political questions and in political elections and all sorts of advocacy and the rest. And Penna, now there is a possibility that the Supreme Court this time, because of Neil Gorsuch sitting on the bench, might actually change that ruling that's been in effect for more than 40 years.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a case out of California in which this could have actually been taken care of before Scalia's death.
Right.
And then he died right in the middle of the case, so it was a 4-4 ruling. So now it's the case is the Janus case. And I think we've posted something about it at pointofview.net, David French's piece about it. But really, it's going back to that very question, whether your public dues, whether you have to pay that dues. And, you know, it's for lots of other benefits. And that's why they argue that everybody, all teachers, all public employees should be forced to pay it. But it also expresses views that are mostly on the liberal side of the equation on all sorts of issues. So it's forcing people to really into speech that they don't agree with. And it's one of many cases of compelled speech that we're now looking at in our public arena today. So I think it's very appropriate.
Let's pull out our constitutions. Debbie has hers. I've got mine holding up here. First Amendment, you know, we always talk about freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but the First Amendment also freedom of assembly. And certainly the idea that if indeed you should not be compelled. Now, Penna, we've already talked about that with Masterpiece Cake. And also another one about these pro-life pregnancy centers. So this is another one of those compelled speech kind of issues, but this one isn't so much speech as it is assembly. So as a lawyer, Debbie, help us out here.
I love the idea that we recognized early on in First Amendment jurisprudence that you not only have the right to speak freely, but you have the right not to be forced or compelled to speak, especially compelled to speak about something that you don't want to talk about or don't agree with. And that's what really this case is getting is if you're a public union employee and you pay your agency fees, actually in the public union context, and the public union is then using your money to pay for their negotiators, their whole union process, to negotiate for things you don't believe in, does that constitute a coerced, forcing you to speak? I think it's a great decision. It's a great case. It really brings the issue into focus. And there was a great exchange. I think it's in the article you posted, but it was.
Explain that.
Yeah, well, what was so interesting, it wasn't, it was a great thing which justice it was who was doing this, because Justice Kennedy, the perpetually unreliable, never know where he's going to go, but he's seen in this case to get the issue. In the very short exchange, he's asking the lawyer for the unions, I'm asking you whether or not, in your view, if you do not prevail in this case, the unions will have less political influence, yes or no? And this was after several times of the lawyer not answering the question, which you're all trained to do in law school. But Mr. Frederick, the lawyer for unions, said, yes, unions will have less political influence. And Justice Kennedy said, isn't that the end of the case?
Yes.
And it really is. It's an astonishing thing. I think that, Penna, you're so right about how this is fraught with political issues and the support, mainly in the American left, for the power of unions, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And so this is a decision I think some justices, if they're not inclined to be really rooted in the Constitution, they don't want to in any way weaken public unions. But you think about, so there's a political tug at the left, but, the core of not just the First Amendment, which is individual right to speak or not speak, but the core of our whole founding was the freedom of the individual. And if you're going to say a public union, in order to have a job as a public school teacher, as an example, you have to pay dues, which someone's going to use to argue things that you don't believe in. I don't think it's even close. I think the court I hope, is going to come down the side against the public union and in favor of the individual employee, saying, I don't want to pay dues. It's like you, listeners, if you were forced to pay towards some organization that was going to go out and argue for something you are utterly opposed to, arguing for pro-abortion or some other thing that you deeply oppose. So it's a great case, and it sounds like it might come out the right way.
Yeah, and I want to clarify something I said, because it's really not that people are forced to join a union. In fact, it's the forcing of the paying of these agency fees.
Yes, right.
People that don't join unions still have to pay the fees, because then the argument's been, well, there's collective bargaining involved and things that benefit you. But this compelled speech about issues that you could be on the polar opposite side of is what's egregious. And so I think it's going to be great. And, we're all pretty sanguine about it because of Justice Kennedy was so strong in his questioning, and now we have Neil Gorsuch. So hopefully it goes the right way.
This also makes a case, Debbie, that you and I and Kelly have made, and Penna sometimes as well, so all of us have made it, and that is, this isn't a case about whether or not those union dues or the various agency fees are going to support liberals, because if you're really going to look at this constitutionally, even if the SEIU union was going to conservative values, we would still reject this. And a good example, you just mentioned his name, would be Antonin Scalia, because the case that you use so often, and I was here in 1984 when I was at the Republican convention and saw the man burning the flag, which went all the way to Supreme Court, even though Justice Scalia disagreed with his burning the flag, he also had to say that burning the flag is free speech. And so even though I disagree with what he did, I have to agree that he has the right to do it constitutionally. And I would have to say that Justice Kennedy and Neil Gorsuch and all the others, Samuel Alito, even if all this money was going to conservative causes, which they would agree with, they would still say this is wrong because you're compelling individuals, both in speech and in assembly, to do something that contradicts their stated belief, and that is against the Constitution. Is that a fair statement?
I'm so glad you raised that point. Yeah, it's a very, very important point. And I know I may have sounded like we're going off on this correct political outcome to be, not favoring left-wing support of unions, but it really isn't about left-wing, right-wing, liking unions or not liking unions. That's why the individual is forced to pay fees. The other thing that was interesting, I thought, that made note in this article was how, public unions, when they are negotiating, they are taking positions on all sorts of issues, even if they're just negotiating to say how much should our team be paid here? How much should these people be paid? We're taking positions. The examples in this article, we're talking about unions advocate about the size, scope, and fiscal health of a state or local government. I mean, it's woven into even negotiations about pay and insurance are political things, I'm so glad you made that point. Whether you're conservative or liberal, we should not agree as respecters of the Constitution to coerce speech.
One other point just before we take a break, and then we'll take some phone calls. We have a number of cases all about compelled speech. We're, first of all, the Masterpiece Cake Shop, and that is Jack Phillips. And so whether or not a Christian baker can use his artistic talents to celebrate a gay marriage. Then another one in the article is the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates. This is whether or not the state can actually compel one of these pregnancy resource centers to post advertisements for abortion. And then this third case, which again, Penna, you mentioned is the Janus case, is whether or not we can compel people to pay agency fees or union dues for something they disagree with. If this is 3 for 3 in the case of liberty, we are in a very different kind of America. But if it's 0 for 3 and goes the other way, we're also in a very different America.
And we're really confused if they split.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
Good line. So if you want to read more about that, maybe you're part of a union, you're wondering, well, what about the other aspects, compulsory unionism and stuff like that? That is something we may get to another day. But that's an article that we've posted here, The First Amendment and Public Unions. There's another one we'll get to after the break by George Will, and that has to do with the First Amendment and free speech. And I love how he starts that. Apparently the man going in to vote was not somebody that goes to Brooks Brothers. I am wearing a Brooks Brothers shirt today in honor of
Looks
that.
very nice.
But I was wearing a T-shirt instead. And since some of you are in this election season, you can recognize that sometimes you're told you cannot wear certain things that advocate for a particular candidate. But when it says live free or die, is that too much? And so this is another one of these free speech cases. So we'll go around the round table and let Penna and Debbie explain a little bit more about that. And if you'd like to join our conversation today, we're talking about First Amendment issues a little bit later. We have a lot more to cover. Donald Trump has rattled a lot of people's cages with everything he said on trade restrictions and tariffs and guns. And so we've got lots to cover. We will not cover it all in 2 hours, but we'll do our best. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
It's good to periodically unpack the Lord's Prayer so it's never vain repetition. Two Christian apologists do this in a 2001 interview Lee Strobel conducted with Hank Hanegraaff on Hank's book, The Prayer of Jesus. The two men agree, in this prayer, no words are wasted. In beginning with Our Father, Jesus taught his disciples to address God as Father. Only those adopted into the family of God could actually pray Our Father. It's plural, Hank says, because we come before God as a community of faith that stretches throughout history. Praying, Hallowed be thy name, places our focus on God and his nature. Hank Hanegraaff says this is to pray that God be given the unique reverence that his holiness demands. He explains that when we pray, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, we're praying that God would expand his rule over the territory of our hearts, areas in our hearts that still belong to us, rooms that have not yet been swept clean. We're also asking that God would extend his territory in the kingdom of this world, and we're acknowledging the promised second coming of Christ. The two men lament that believers often rush into the presence of God with a laundry list of requests. But by this point in the Lord's Prayer, we have put into context the requests that follow. When praying for our daily bread, we ask not just for ourselves, but also for the needs of our brothers and sisters around the world. In asking God to forgive us our trespasses, we acknowledge that it is a horrendous evil even to consider withholding forgiveness from those who seek forgiveness from us. Finally, with lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, we acknowledge the power of our adversary Satan, but recognize that he is a lion on a leash whose length God controls. There's more, a wealth of meaning in this concise prayer. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis, and our second article here by George Will. And I do love that. Unaware that in 2018 is Brooks Brothers bicentennial. Judging by what he wore, probably wasn't carrying a Brooks Brothers suit on, but instead had a chatty T-shirt. But Debbie, let me come to you for just a minute. You are a lawyer around the table here, because we recognize that some states forbid wearing things in the polling places that could be political badges. But how far do we go to tell people they can't even wear a T-shirt that really has nothing to do with the political cases that are in front of us right at that time?
I think this is one time or maybe there are more than one that I disagree with where George Will comes out on this. I have worked as an election judge in elections. I know in Texas where we are, we have a law you can't wear a shirt in the polling place saying, vote for Joe.
Or a badge or a button or anything. Yeah, got it.
Just have
That's
to be
not what
neutral.
he's talking about here.
Right. So the gentleman in this T-shirt case, I think he had the "Don't Tread on Me," which is a Tea Party symbol. Was that what it was on his shirt? I think.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really, you can think of a million examples where, well, what if you say, save the planet? Is that a left-wing message? And so you're saying vote for Democrats? Or if you say, secure the borders, is that a right-wing message? And so you can have all sorts of language on shirts. And the other argument about it is, within the context of the voting arena, is that you are bumping up your free speech right to wear whatever you want to wear. You're bumping up against the obligation of the state to hold elections that are free and unhindered by if you had someone in the voting room who was walking around and pestering voters as they're trying to vote, saying, "Don't vote for him, vote for her," you would say, "No, you can't do that. You're supposed to be respecting the individual's right to go in and vote." And so I think, to just make it the easiest thing of all, just no messages on T-shirts. I can get with that, and I know that sounds inconsistent.
So
with my
because you
usual-
wouldn't want to give it to the election judges to discern
Yes.
on the spot. So, yeah, I get that too, but I still think that this is
over
wrong.
the top.
Over
this
the
thing?
top.
Yeah, I don't know the number of states that have those kind of controls. I love the idea of the voting booth, the voting area, being free of pressure and even unspoken pressure. So, it gets really funny. It's like, well, okay, so if you don't have on a, words on your T-shirt, but you just have on, Che Guevara or I don't know. You can get to where it gets silly. And his other point here is, are we really such snowflakes in America that you can't go in and vote how you want to vote because somebody next to you has a T-shirt on you don't like?
Yeah.
I do get that point. But I don't like the voting judges, the election judges, to have to decide. And I can kind of get with just no message on your T-shirt when you go in and vote, and that I'm so unlike what I usually think.
Yesterday, actually, we have elections here in Texas. I voted in the primaries yesterday in early voting, and so I was bringing in. The ballot is huge, so I had to bring in notes, to figure out how I was going to vote, and I had it all folded up in my purse. But I heard one of the election judges say you can't bring a cell phone in that has,
Yes.
like people will email you who to vote for, or you'll get a list from a website of who to vote for. You can't bring that in. I'm not sure the reason for that. Maybe you guys know the difference between having a piece of paper that tells you, maybe I had a pro-life organization's, among other things, in my purse, their list. So what's the difference? Why not be able to bring your cell phone in?
I think the argument was that you might be on the phone and somebody tells you how to vote, and so that's what they don't want any coercion. But you're right. In this day and age when people carry information electronically rather than printed. But I think there is a bigger issue, and that is, where are we going to allow no free speech zones? Right now we say, let's use the state of Texas, you can't have any electioneering within about 100 feet of the polls. But if you drive a little further north from this studio, there's a place that has a much broader no free speech zone in McKinney, which some people say, wait a minute, you can't do that. Around an abortion clinic, you have supposedly a no free speech zone because there are these barriers and boundaries. So even though this may seem like kind of a silly case, this one guy wearing a Gadsden flag that says, "Don't tread on me," there's some bigger issues free speech-wise and at stake when we talk about this, because when you get onto a college campus, essentially some of these whole campuses are no free speech zones, aren't they?
Yeah, and so that's why in the culture, we've created snowflakes among that generation. We don't want to expand it to us older folks that are out there voting.
That's funny. I voted yesterday too, and I actually had a T-shirt on for a candidate because I've been helping this candidate, and so I zipped my jacket up over the shirt. It was not visible. Went in and voted, and went back out. But I do think it's. I agree with you. I'm usually the ardent supporter of free speech and the notion that the most healthy thing in Western civilization is robust debate and hearing both sides, be able to have a conversation. There's something about the voting booth, though. Anyone who is feeling, you shouldn't be so snowflakey that you were going to vote for so-and-so, but then the guy next to you had a different shirt on. You should be a better citizen than that. But I can understand for just keeping it easy, and not putting the election judge in that position,
right?
Who going to have to say, well, your shirt's okay, but yours is not. I don't know. I can go with just let it be a place you just can't be you doing your free speech thing.
Let's, in the second hour, spend some time talking about Donald Trump. He's got some comments about gun control and tariffs. We've posted a piece by Ann Coulter, too, which I wanted to get to because it's the idea of the school-to-prison pipeline, which gives us a little more insight in what was happening in Parkland, Florida. But along the way, let's take some phone calls. I do want to give some of you who've taken one call, and we haven't done very good at getting to your calls. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Missouri this time. KCMH. Dave, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes. Which constitutional amendments does Islam violate?
Well, you've heard me talk about that before, and matter of fact, in my little booklet on Sharia law, I talk about the numbers to remember are 1, 8, and 14. And again, you can get a copy of our Sharia law booklet because I've used this as an illustration so often that, first of all, Islam, especially if you wanted Sharia law, and most individuals sooner or later that are Muslims believe some aspect of Sharia law should be implemented, and one stands for the First Amendment. Now, the problem with that is Sharia law would eliminate any other kind of religious expression. So that would be very difficult because if indeed you're in a country that has Sharia law, then Islam is the only religion and no other religion is given equal protection. And so you would have the establishment of one religion and you would not allow the free exercise of another. 8 stands for the Eighth Amendment, and that has to do with the fact that we cannot have cruel and unusual punishment. And anybody that reads my little booklet on Sharia law will figure out real quickly that by definition, a lot of what is commanded under Sharia law, and even some of that which is found in the Quran, would be cruel and unusual punishment. And then 14 stands for the 14th Amendment, and that is equal protection. And women, I hate to say it, but if you're in a country that has Sharia law, and we mentioned this yesterday with Michael Yosef, you do not have the same equal rights as a man. You receive half of inheritance compared to another brother. You have to sometimes have 4 witnesses to counteract a male in a court. So if you can just remember the numbers 1, 8, and 14, you can see how at least on those 3 amendments, Islam violates the Constitution.
Wow. Thanks, Kirby. Good response. It's a good response. This is what Point of View is all about, ladies and gentlemen, is getting a good response for the questions that come up. And this one is a big one.
It is. And again, it's in our little booklet called Sharia Law. We make that available to you that are donors. And if you'd like to get a copy, we still, I think, have a few left. We send it out to those of you that are part of the Truth Team. Matter of fact, the most recent one is on privacy and surveillance, one coming out on the Second Amendment, and also one related to everything we've been talking about, making your vote count. I've been giving these away like nothing else. Just amazing. Anyway, we need to take a break. Donald Trump has said quite a bit today and the last couple of days, and I want to get our roundtable discussion going on that and also maybe learning some lessons about what was happening in Parkland, Florida. So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, it is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis with us. And if you were not with us the first hour, you may want to go back and listen. We've talked about everything from Billy Graham to a number of First Amendment cases that have gone to the Supreme Court. Of course, we heard from Debbie about what happened at CPAC and a number of other things. We even talked about Islam for just a minute before we took our break at the top of the hour. But this hour, I want to get into some other issues related to President Donald Trump. We're going to talk about this idea of tariffs and trade restrictions and the rest. Now, don't turn it off. I know sometimes this can sound a little bit esoteric, but we actually have the next issue of Outlook magazine coming out to really explain a little bit about some of the previous trade deals. And I wrote an article, Nick Pitts wrote one, and he even used gummy bears to illustrate some of the issues of trade. So I think you will actually find it really interesting and maybe learn some things about that. But Donald Trump, the President Trump, has suggested that we will have tariffs now on steel and aluminum. We'll see whether that's anything more than a trial balloon being floated. He's also suggested the other day, as the vice president was talking about having some kind of restraining orders and other kinds of things, that maybe it'd be better just to take the guns and do due process later. So we're going to take some issues with Donald Trump on these topics, and then get into, as we talk about guns, a little bit more that we've learned about what was happening there in Parkland, Florida. And, of course, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Let's get into the issue of trade. Mr. President, your trade protection will cost the U.S. dearly, is what one of the editorials in Investors Business Daily has to say. Maybe we need to educate everybody about what tariffs would actually do. Penna?
Well, and, not surprisingly, the Wall Street Journal said that he made the biggest policy blunder of his presidency in announcing this. A 25% tariff on steel, a 10% tariff on aluminum. The Dow fell on the news yesterday, 1.7%. I heard it was falling again today. It will benefit a handful of companies, and, this is one of his campaign promises. But I think when you look at the companies that use steel, who would have to buy steel at a higher price, and the point the Journal made was that U.S. steel companies would raise their prices almost to the same level that the foreign companies would have to pay with the tariff. So you'd be making steel more expensive, which hurts a lot more people. I mean, think of cars, think of aluminum cans. So many things use these products. So what you're doing is hurting the average American worker, the average American consumer. And that's the point the Journal makes. It would affect the transportation industry to a huge degree. And so, in fact, Ford fell 3%, GM fell 4%, already on the news. So, as you said, Kirby, it could be a trial balloon. Maybe when he sees that, I don't know that he wants this to be his legacy. It has hurt other presidents to impose tariffs on steel. And it's controversial even inside the Trump administration.
Yes, it is. That's the other point. There are just a lot of people that might be saying, does this make a lot of sense right now? The reaction of the stock market. Now, the stock market's been in the midst of a correction, so you can't blame all of it on this announcement, although his opponents will. But it brings us back to a bigger issue, and that is we knew when Donald Trump was elected that even though he announced at CPAC, look at all the conservative things I've done, I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop. I mean, this is a man that's been in New York City. He certainly wants to protect businesses. He, in many cases, has had some pretty liberal stands on some issues. And so when you start having him make some statements about tariffs, or maybe we'll postpone due process a little bit later, I guess we shouldn't be that surprised. Sometimes Donald Trump just shoots from the lip, doesn't he?
I've never heard that, shoots from the lip. You know, it is real, especially very serious business-oriented people and economists are aware of American history on the subject of tariffs. And it may be, I'm hopeful that, Donald Trump ran on and people I loved his reassertion of the place and importance of America, the need to hold America, to have America first in terms contemplating the needs of American businesses and individuals as part of his America First kind of overall theme, and did feel like we had been in trade deals in the past that were unfairly detrimental to America, that we had not had free and honest trade, but we had our trade partners who were misbehaving. So a simple sounding solution is something like this, a simple sounding solution that just basically says, dang it, those people, we're going to stick a tariff on, that'll fix them. But I think he's not, he is a very bright man. He may not be necessarily learned on the history of tariffs and the consequence of tariffs, but, I hope he's going to be soon informed by people around him that dating back, that's what I was looking at on my phone, I'm not sure the year, 1930 was a Smoot-Hawley.
Smoot-Hawley.
Yeah. And it was designed
signed by another businessman, Herbert
Hoover. Yeah,
right?
President Hoover signed. But, it was it has a kind of an emotional, instinctual, yeah, that'll fix them. We'll stick a tariff on them. But the real economists will tell you over and over that it isn't as though you make a decision, a move in isolation. You slap a tariff on, and then consequences flow. The ones Penna was mentioning a moment ago, the cost to American industries. Yes. And then the trade partner you're dealing with doesn't usually just say, oh, okay, you'll just do that. I mean, they respond. Then you get in trade wars, you get retaliation and rates being raised, and it does not end up benefiting either American businesses, American individuals, but I also, or the foreign, manufacturers too. We really are best in the world if there's a healthy economy in many, many countries that can engage in trade. So I think I'm hopeful to what you were both alluding to. I'm hopeful that maybe this is just a, trial balloon kind of thing where he's saying, look, foreign countries, some of you have not been dealing fairly. China especially is a problem. And don't think I won't do this. I mean, those countries, even though they may recognize long term that these tariffs hurt everyone and that you get into trade wars, they really don't want America to do this. And so maybe it's kind of a hint from Trump, you need to listen to what we're saying in our negotiations. You need to come to the table and stop the things that are wrong. Or otherwise, just don't think I won't do this. So I'm hoping maybe it's that kind of thing.
One of the other things he said during the campaign is he didn't like NAFTA, and he also said some things about the World Trade Organization and GATT. So the next issue of Outlook magazine that's just about ready to come out, I do kind of an analysis of some of those things, NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization. But again, as you just mentioned a minute ago, you might want to look up the Smoot-Hawley rule and the law, because you had Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Harley that in 1930 passed this particular tariff, and this took the Great Depression, and which was already a real disaster, and made it worse. So this is not the road we want to head down, and sometimes our eyes sort of glaze over when we talk about trade deals and tariffs and things like that. But Penna, it affects what we actually are able to purchase in our homes and the cost of living.
Yeah, Debbie mentioned retaliation from other countries. Some of that could be affect our agricultural industry, for instance, and the food stuffs that we produce. And, there will be damage and harm. It just depends on what sector of the economy is harmed and what sector benefits. And I'm looking at the stats in the Wall Street Journal and also the Daily Signal that comes from Heritage Foundation did a real simple piece on it.
Very good.
But Trump policies are going to really help the economy. This may take us a couple steps backwards.
Let's go back and make the economy boom rather than bust. And we know which one works and which one doesn't. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, the news over the last year has been about the surveillance of the Trump campaign and administration. But there is another more personal issue. How much surveillance has the federal government done of your life? John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute was on my radio program recently to talk about the threat we all face from government and business surveillance. We began by quoting from the Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. In a case back in 1966, he warned, "We are rapidly entering the age of no privacy, where everyone is open to surveillance at all times, where there are no secrets from government." How right he was. The government has become expert in finding ways to sidestep what is considered inconvenient laws aimed at ensuring accountability. For example, the National Security Agency has been diverting Internet traffic overseas. This helps them bypass Fourth Amendment and other constitutional protections and allows them to conduct unrestrained data collection on each of us. I asked John Whitehead about the stories of the government hacking into Google and Yahoo data centers. He responded that they really don't have to do that since these entities and others willingly turn over such data. He estimates that on any given day, the average American is monitored, surveilled, tracked, and spied upon in more than 20 different ways. We also talked about the recent column by John Cass, who wondered whatever happened to liberals concerned about civil liberties and government surveillance of American citizens. He concluded that since it was happening to Trump officials, those who used to be concerned about such issues now turn a blind eye to it all. We shouldn't ignore what is happening, and that's why I've written a point of view booklet on surveillance and privacy to warn citizens about what is happening. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about trade, we'll take a call on that, but then get into some of the other comments. Donald Trump had some things to say about guns and gun control. We also have a piece by Ann Coulter, which was a surprise to some of us about some of the policies being implemented there by the Broward County Sheriff's Department and the school. But let me take a phone call real quickly related to the trade issue, and we'll go to Arizona first, and that is Lisa. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi. I disagree with you guys as far as the aluminum and that. Sorry, I was just running from work.
That's okay. Well, tell us about the aluminum. Are you working in an area where aluminum is an important manufacturing issue?
I used to, but not anymore. My reasoning is we've closed the steel mills. We don't make ships. We don't do any of that. They've gone all overseas. I don't even know if the EPA is going to allow us to start doing that kind of thing again. I think that might be Donald Trump's hope, but we're going to have to take it somewhere and take the hits if we want to be independent here. And we're going to have to make these products here if we want to be independent. And that's kind of how he ran, and that's how I see it. I want to be an independent country. I don't want to be relying on anyone. I do like the fact that, I like trees. I like clean water. We've got to figure out a way to do it, but we have to be realistic. We also have to keep people working. And I think if we wanted to do this, it's going to hurt for a while.
Do you think we're at risk of not being able to get these aluminum and steel, for instance? Because that was one of the main reason he announced this. He used national security arguments that we didn't want to be put in a position where we couldn't make weapons and tanks and things because we were dependent on foreign steel. So do you think that's a risk for us?
Yes, I do. I'm not in their trades or in their businesses, and I don't know how fast we can open up plants if it's even a possibility. I think this is a long-term goal that we need to be, and I don't know if we're ready for it, but I'm not Donald Trump, and I trust him. That's why we hired him, and I don't think he's the best guy in the world, but I think he's trying, and I hired him for his business smarts and his connections, and I know the left is slowly destroying that probably for him, but that's another reason why I admire the man is he's putting it all on the line. Who's done that since the country was formed? I mean, we really haven't, but he's made the money. He went out and did it, and now he's putting it on the line, and I don't know what he's going to have left after he gets out of office if the left has their way. And I'm concerned for our country as far as our safety. I think we're going to be in trouble any way you look at it because they don't like Donald Trump and what he believes in. And so we either take it now or take it later, these hits. And maybe he knows something we don't know. Maybe he's got connections where they're going to open up plants. I don't know.
Well,
we're kind of second-guessing him.
One other reason we hired him is negotiating skills.
Yeah.
And I still think that might have been just like a first kind of
the big ask, and then
the shot across the bow. And speaking of manufacturing, he has touted the fact that we have had hundreds of thousands, and I was trying to get the exact number of manufacturing jobs that have come back to the United States. Now, that is a very different idea because we heard certainly Mitt Romney and some others, and that goes back a few years ago, saying, once you've lost those jobs, you've lost them forever. But doesn't seem to be the case. If you provide an economically advantageous environment, individuals that had moved manufacturing overseas will bring it back to the United States. And don't you think this tax reform plan is doing some of that?
Mm-hmm. I do, definitely. And I was going to say, Lisa, if you're still listening, I agree with what you're saying. I want Americans working. I want jobs here. I don't want to ever surrender the notion of the steel manufacturing, which you were saying has largely been shut down and moved away. I don't want to have all of what we need manufactured abroad. I agree with you that we need to have Americans working and Americans producing our own what we need, and we need to have a government reining in the EPA so that we can have manufacturing of things that maybe the EPA made too difficult or too expensive to do here. And I think that's also been happening under President Trump too. There has been a real reining in of regulation, but I think that the instinct to protect America, which I love. It's the whole reason I do my radio show is to talk about America. But the idea of protecting it by doing an economic policy that seems in the past to have hurt us, it seems like we may not end up where we hope we will. I would rather advocate for a robust return of business to America, reducing EPA's power to shut it down, and then keep free, kind of like free markets in America are what free trade is to internationally, to the extent you can.
Yes. Okay, well, let's move on. And again, some of the comments that we've already heard. While we're speaking about EPA, just for a second, I think Scott Pruitt's done a pretty good job of actually reining in some of those regulations, don't you think?
He's making the left crazy, so therefore I think so. But, I mean, he really is. And, he's unafraid to say things about climate change, which is like this verboten topic. You can never question any of the theology, the religion of climate change, and he does in very straightforward ways. So yeah, I've been happy with him.
We had somebody else wanted to comment on tariffs, but then had to hang up. So we're going to move on to the next. Well, unless you have
there's one other just point I think to be made, because we have so much free trade and we are so internationally independent that couldn't it be that companies will go overseas and manufacture products using steel or aluminum, and then export them back because they will have cheaper steel and aluminum overseas. So, I mean, I think in some ways, I don't know if we could ever bring independence back the way it once was. We're
No.
just too interconnected now.
That was kind of the idea of Smoot-Hawley. You know, you had gone through the First World War, then you had the Roaring Twenties. We were in the Great Depression, and so everybody was isolationist in terms of politics, and we tried to become isolationist in terms of the economy, and it destroyed America. I mean, I hate to place all the blame at the feet of Herbert Hoover and Smoot and Hawley, but there's a lot of it that goes right there, and we're just so interdependent now that just doesn't make any sense anymore. You know, we used to have the GDP and the GNP. Well, we used to use GNP because we said ultimately we can try to track all of the national production, and eventually went to GDP. We just couldn't do it anymore because there are just too many interconnected things between the United States and other countries. We live in a global market, and so that's just something we just have to face. Like it or not, that's the world that we find ourselves in right now. Just before we take a break, though, what about this other issue? Okay, I'll go back to our lawyer here. Take the guns, due process later. Now, this has to do with, I think, a very concrete suggestion, which I even wrote about in a commentary earlier in the week, that you could come up with a restraining order. If you have an individual like the shooter there in Parkland, you know that he is a dangerous person. You could go to court and you could get an order so that you could at least temporarily remove those Second Amendment rights from that individual, remove the guns for that individual. Everybody says, great. Donald Trump, in the midst of it, says, yeah, let's just take the guns and worry about due process later. Your thoughts, Debbie?
No. He just talks off the cuff. You know, it is his style, and I think he always will. People wishing he'll sometime speak in a more measured way, or we're going to be disappointed. But, you know, what he was trying to say, I think, is what you were trying to say, and I think
Speed it up.
Yeah, which is you're concerned if you've had this young man in Parkland who'd had that many times, you know, threatened his mother with a gun, all the times called to the school, students turning him in, complaining, really alarming things, threats being posted in text and on Instagram and on his Facebook. You know, that just the guy is dangerous, and so that is really But I have to say, I'm such a so the due process notion of you are protected before your rights are ever taken away. The government has to afford you due process, follow the normal processes of law. So if that were to be the case that you're describing, you're going to say, well, this particular case, because we're concerned he may do something really harmful, there'd have to be an expeditious process set in place. So,
Sure.
You know, okay, right now you're a danger to us, but that very narrow time, and it has to, because I do feel very concerned about the broader notion of the government taking guns away and having the right to, everyone can agree on this guy because obviously he really had mental problems, but, you know, there are people who think that, I don't know, the Tea Party is kind of crazy, lots of other political groups are kind of crazy, so you have to have it very narrowly drawn and very limited because you can't, the notion of giving the government the right to take away your right to a gun before you've been adjudicated as not deserving one, it can be alarming.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, this piece by Ann Coulter was an eye-opener for some of us because there have actually been people even writing to us saying, I've heard something about the policy that they weren't going to actually try to put people in jail, and it's called the school-to-prison pipeline. And you had this young man who was a ticking time bomb, and yet nothing happened. Now we know a little bit more. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis with us, and the fourth article that we have posted on our website today by Ann Coulter is entitled "The School to Mass Murder Pipeline." Well, that's not what it is, but it was called the School to Prison Pipeline, or what was the other one? Progress?
The Promise Plan.
Promise Plan. And people have been asking, why is it when we knew that this psychotic individual, this time bomb ready to explode, 39 different visits, all sorts of alerting the FBI and the local sheriff, was nothing happening? Well, now we know a little bit more about what it was. And so tell us about this progress decision. Ann Coulter writes about it. There's 3 pages, but you've actually got the original document. So educate us, Debbie, if you could.
I'll try to do it quickly, but there was a settlement in November of 2013 involving a long series of parties: the school board, the chief judge of the 17th District Court, but the state attorney, the Broward County, the public defenders. They entered a settlement that was designed to correct a problem that had been called to the attention of the school district, which was that from Broward County and many of the school districts, a disproportionate number of students who ended up being prosecuted during high school, while they were still in high school, prosecuted for a crime and ended up in juvenile detention or in criminal courts, a disproportionate percentage of them were black. And so part of the argument was, instead of having teachers turn to criminal charges and calling the police when criminal conduct occurs on campus, they set up they use the term matrix, a long series of steps that law enforcement has to follow, or that the school has to follow, and even when law enforcement's called, they cannot arrest right away. It was essentially designed to more or less prohibit arrest of a high school student for conduct at the school or during a school function. So it was so that kids didn't leave high school with basically no ability to go to college or get a job because they already have a felony or a criminal conviction on their record. Yeah. So, but among the many ironies of this was it caused everyone involved, to hesitate when dealing with criminal conduct. And the groups that they named were overrepresented in arrests and ending up with a record before they finished high school was not just students of color, but also mentions students with disabilities, which could not possibly be true. That's ridiculous. And LGBTQ students. They were trying to have a broad, politically correct listing of the potential students protected by this. But the net of it was it made school officials and police hesitant to arrest. And so in Broward County, this was put in place. So now you have this kid who's got a Hispanic last name, Nicholas Cruz. You can imagine people in Broward County aware that he probably falls in the students of color category. He'd been extremely problematic all the way through high school, shifted around various high schools, threatened his mother with a gun, police at the house 39 times, threatened other students, sent pictures of them. Just could not have been screaming more, I'm a really big problem. The last real quick thing I'll tell you, the FBI was called at one point by a female relative of his, and the FBI, the transcript of that phone call was published in the Wall Street Journal last week. And this woman, she didn't say how she's related, but she's related to this kid. She actually said the words, I'm concerned he'll shoot up a school someday. I need you to do something. Can I tell you where he lives? Can I tell you what he is? Here's his Instagram account. She was screaming for help, and no one did anything until this horrific incident occurred.
One of the things I rarely do is say the name of the shooter, and yet this is one time when you mentioned it, and it's worth mentioning because his name was Cruz. And so he is an individual that probably would fit into that category.
Yep.
And again, and you read through the article, I think it's the 5th paragraph, here's some of the statements. I'm going to enjoy seeing you down on the grass. I'm going to watch you bleed. I'm going to shoot you dead. First of all, his grammar's terrible, and the spelling is as well. But and again, 39 visits. And then, of course, we have the sheriff there saying we've done an admirable job, an excellent job. Everybody's rolling their eyes on that one. But again, here, moved around from school to school, 6 transfers in 3 years. This is a question, Penna and Debbie, that have been asked by many of our callers. Why didn't they do something? Now we know there was a policy in place that prevented them from doing something.
So the PROMISE stands for Preventing Recidivism Through Opportunities, Mentoring, Interventions, Supports, and Education. Doesn't that just sound like a liberal mantra to you? And what it really is we're mainstreaming all problems into the school, so all kids have to deal with the special kids that have a lot of problems. And in this case, they're forcing all the kids to deal with this quote-unquote special kid who has all these problems. And look at the price they paid. The sheriff, there was federal funding involved in this PROMISE program, And so the sheriff was proud of the fact that the arrest rate in the schools had dropped 63%. And, even after the shooting, he's still talking about how he's done a good job. It's so sad. And there's even been calls in this one piece that I was reading, and I think it was Daniel Horowitz in the Conservative Review, really critiquing some of the stuff that comes out of the Department of Education. And, it's really true. Why do we even need a Department of Education? Everything that the Department of Education does hurts the public schools.
I agree with that, and I'll tell you on this, first of all, I'm sure we all should say it once, but your heart goes out to these families. They sent their kid to school. The worst concern that morning was, did Susie finish her Spanish homework or whatever it was, and your child never comes home. Big changes have to happen. I think everyone's recognizing this. The FBI, what caused them to fail to react? They don't have a mechanism permissible? Do they just not have a mechanism like you were talking about, Kirby, to say, you know what, we've got to get law enforcement involved, and this kid, we've got to, even without due process, get weapons away from him, and then we'll figure out what to do with him. But it is it's monumentally tragic, and I think it's enough that you will cause some changes to happen. And this promise thing, the whole notion of saying you have reduced statistics, it's kind of like saying, if we stop giving out speeding tickets, we'll have a much better record on people not speeding. Well, that's not what you're doing. You're just failing to be honest about what's really happening.
We always swing back and forth between being easy on crime and tough on crime. And there's been an agenda, and it really comes from the left, to be more lenient on crime. And this is what happens. A lot of times they say, well, we can save money by incarcerating fewer people. And, of course, in this case, it's the young people. But that is where government really has a role. It has a role in controlling the crime that takes place and protecting the citizens. And I think the government is derelict when it actually incentivizes being easy on crime.
One of the questions I want to put to our callers here, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Did the system fail this individual? Here, again, in the third paragraph, he assaulted students, he cursed out teachers, he kicked in classroom doors, he started fistfights, he threw chairs, he threatened to kill other students, he mutilated small animals, where's Pito now that we need him, pulled a rifle on his mother, drank gasoline, cut himself, among other red flags. And then we have the CNN town hall where the problem is the NRA, which is a domestic terrorist organization. The sheriff who accuses the one spokesperson for the NRA of not caring about the students when they know behind the scenes that they actually made some really significant mistakes and decided not to actually deal with an individual who was a time bomb ready to explode. And yet we keep hearing that the real problem is guns, right?
Yeah, the NRA thing, and I know I don't know how much time we have on this topic, but what is so problematic is that the failure of the FBI, the local officials, the school officials, the Broward County Sheriff, the police department to actually take action, all of that gets covered up. And what you see from the media, the CNN and so many other in the left-wing media, is blaming the NRA, which is simply an organization who was not on the scene at the time, had nothing to do with this shooting, and is not really stopping. Even when Barack Obama had, as a Democrat president, the White House, the House, and the Senate, they did not get any gun control legislation through, because the truth is most Americans don't want a lot more gun control. And I want to get this point, and we can go to something else, but the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution is not in there to enable people to go hunting, shooting practice, or even for the purpose of permitting you to defend your property and your home. It is there to keep the balance of power between the government and the people. It is incumbent on Congress and the entire federal government to recognize that Second Amendment. And I'm not a big gun person. I'm not a big gun person at all, but the power of the government to control the people when nobody is armed is evident when you look at Cuba, China, Russia. All sorts of places where individuals cannot own guns is where the government has all the power. And that's why the Second Amendment is there. And that's why it's so important to be very, very narrow in any exceptions or any limitations on the right of adults to own guns.
That's why George Mason and James Madison actually put it in there and borrowed it from another declaration that talked about the right to keep and bear arms. It was something that had been written before. And the shot heard round the world in Lexington, that's because they were going to confiscate the guns in Concord, right? Let's take a break. We'll take your phone calls right after this.
It's good to periodically unpack the Lord's Prayer so it's never vain repetition. Two Christian apologists do this in a 2001 interview Lee Strobel conducted with Hank Hanegraaff on Hank's book, The Prayer of Jesus. The two men agree, in this prayer, no words are wasted. In beginning with Our Father, Jesus taught his disciples to address God as Father. Only those adopted into the family of God could actually pray Our Father. It's plural, Hank says, because we come before God as a community of faith that stretches throughout history. Praying, Hallowed be thy name, places our focus on God and his nature. Hank Hanegraaff says this is to pray that God be given the unique reverence that his holiness demands. He explains that when we pray, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, we're praying that God would expand his rule over the territory of our hearts, areas in our hearts that still belong to us, rooms that have not yet been swept clean. We're also asking that God would extend his territory in the kingdom of this world, and we're acknowledging the promised second coming of Christ. The two men lament that believers often rush into the presence of God with a laundry list of requests. But by this point in the Lord's Prayer, we have put into context the requests that follow. When praying for our daily bread, we ask not just for ourselves, but also for the needs of our brothers and sisters around the world. In asking God to forgive us our trespasses, we acknowledge that it is a horrendous evil even to consider withholding forgiveness from those who seek forgiveness from us. Finally, with lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, we acknowledge the power of our adversary Satan, but recognize that he is a lion on a leash whose length God controls. There's more, a wealth of meaning in this concise prayer. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Going to get into some other articles, but just before we do so, we talked about gun control, and one article that is something we've posted in the past came from David French, but it actually goes back to an ability to check out what is really going to make a difference. And you might remember both at the CNN town hall meeting with Senator Marco Rubio, as well as some of his other comments, he has made the statement more than once that the gun laws that we have should be implemented, and all the new gun laws and gun restrictions that have been proposed would not have prevented any of these mass shootings. And so that caused a lot of people to say, oh, he can't possibly be right about that. So Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post, who is hardly an NRA apologist, okay, Glenn Kessler is just anything of it, did a fact check. And his fact check asserted that no new gun laws would have prevented any of the mass shootings, and said that statement is true. He was ready to give it 3 or 4 Pinocchios and just simply couldn't
do
not. So there are some things that can happen. And talking about maybe beefing up and having the accurate reporting in the instant criminal background check, that makes some sense. And we've talked about that. And I did a commentary on it on Monday. Or the possibility of restraining order. But nevertheless, that's the point. And back to the point you made, Debbie, if you go back and look at the history of the Second Amendment, the person who's kind of the founder of the Second Amendment is a man by the name of George Mason. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, you get to go through his home. And he was borrowing that, and that was put together. But it goes back to the fact that if you want to talk about the first issue of gun control, it's when the British troops marched from Boston through Lexington to Concord. They wanted to capture all of those guns, and it was very obvious to the colonists that if we are unarmed, the British Empire will destroy us. So the militias and the regulars and the army needed to have guns, and so that's why the Second Amendment is there. Secondarily, you could also say it's there for self-defense. But think that through. If it's for self-defense, then it shows that the Second Amendment is not about muskets and flintlock pistols, because self-defense today, if a person's coming in your door, a robber, a mugger, a terrorist, what are they going to have? They're going to have a gun that most likely has a magazine. It's probably a semi-automatic pistol or a semi-automatic rifle. How are you going to stop that with a semi-automatic pistol or a semi-automatic rifle? That's one of the reasons that the police no longer carry revolvers, because they recognize that the bad guys are going to have something with more capacity than a revolver. So whether you look at the Second Amendment in terms of preventing tyranny, or you look at the Second Amendment in terms of self-defense, in either case, you can see that some of these arguments for gun control simply don't work, do they?
I'll give you 2 great quotes to keep in mind. You can look these up yourself. George Mason, that Kirby was just mentioning, co-author of the Second Amendment, wrote, "To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them." And George Washington wrote, "Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself." And you hear the argument, well, okay, but that was back then. Everything's different now. We're an established country. We're not going to have we don't have anyone to have a revolution against because we're America. But the whole notion that a country can never change, I mean, if you go down that path, you're assuming the country can never change, that we always will have our freedoms. And you look at countries around the world that thought they had freedom. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, Fidel Castro came into power. Yay, Cuba, we won the revolution. We overthrew, what's his name, Batista?
Yeah.
And so turn in all the guns. And that's what the people did. They turned in all their guns, and now, of course, they can't leave. So the notion that any country is permanently free and never has to worry is not right. And the notion that in America, an armed citizenry helps protect the balance of power. The last thing is that, just to be clear, the Heller decision, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Heller, because there was an argument for 200 years that the Second Amendment didn't really mean the individual right to possess arms. And the Heller decision, the Supreme Court decision, I think it was 2008, whenever it was,
2008,
made perfectly clear. It said, no, the Second Amendment was actually intended to allow individuals to possess firearms. Not about militia, not about just you have the right to possess firearms. So it's a really clear thing. And I don't want to be the victim of a gun crime, and I understand the concern about them. But I think it's a vital thing in America.
Yeah, Heller case, and then 2 years later, the McDonald case, because some people said, well, Heller only related to the District of Columbia, so 2 years later it relates to all the states. Go ahead.
You know, it's such an emotional issue, and I think that's why the students and the whole, which we didn't even really get to talk too much about, their whole organizational, protest that's taken place since the shooting, it pulls on the heartstrings of Americans, and then they begin to talk about ways of protection that make, somewhat of common sense. Even like when they use the word assault weapon ban, and they try to equate, for instance, the high magazine rifles with that. But you have to have equal power to defend yourself into that sort of power. And so, we have to get past, I'm so glad, Debbie, that you talked about the history, because we have to get past the emotional arguments. The emotional arguments will carry the day in America now because people aren't well informed about our history. And so we need to be. And, that's the one good thing I think that can come out of these attacks on, for instance, the NRA, is for those the NRA itself and those people who want to protect the Second Amendment to really begin to explain it, to cut through the emotion. If we don't do that, we will, people like Trump, I don't know what he's doing right now because he seems to be giving away the store with regards to the opportunity to own a gun. But it may be another one of his just early negotiating stances. Let's hope so. But I think just making the case with facts is really important. I'm glad you wrote one of these booklets on the Second Amendment. I think Point of View listeners ought to try to get a hold of that. And it's small enough to put in your pocket.
Yes.
And yet
and again,
filled with
one other
facts.
point that you're making, Penna, since we're coming to the end here, we're trying to teach more discernment. And when you hear people talk about the fact that these are assault weapons, or the Fourth Circuit Court, in its inscrutable wisdom, said that you can ban about 70 different kinds of so-called weapons of war, they're equating that an AR-15 is the same thing as an M16. And I have a quick answer, which I mentioned in the new booklet that's coming out, and that is go into any gun store and try to buy an M16, and you will not be able to do so. Why? Because an M16 is a military automatic weapon, which is used for war, and an AR-15 is called a sporting rifle used by civilians, which is semi-automatic. And so, again, I understand that not every judge in the Fourth Circuit Court understands guns, but they should understand enough not to say stupid things in a legal decision, which now will have to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will have to rectify.
I certainly hope they will rectify. I'm glad you mentioned, Penny, your point a moment ago about emotion. It is so true, not just in this policy area, but many, many policies in America. What you hear from the left are emotional arguments, and they are sometimes compelling. You parade a dad or mom across the stage and say, we're heartbroken, we've lost our child. I mean, no parent ever would like to, and no one ever wants to have to go through that. But to make policy off of those emotions is not only leading to poor policy decisions, but can lead to where you eviscerate the Constitution.
Well, let me just mention that you are going to be on radio, and you can go to americacanwetalk.org. You can find it there, or you can find it on Facebook. And matter of fact, if you go on Facebook, usually before you're on the air, you actually are in your car doing a promo. Yes. I've seen a few of those. So that's on Sunday if people would like to listen or watch your program, right?
Yes, Facebook Live, America Can We Talk, 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. And I'd love to have you all tune in.
Again, we covered quite a number. I guess we covered about half of these.
We did great.
We need one more hour. Oh, next week we're going to have another hour, so we'll be talking about that. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back on Monday right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.